off my mask.
All right, welcome to Cons Before and After Bronies. I am one of the community guests here at the fabulous Windy City PonyCon, Chocolate Pony. Nice to see all you here. So I guess this panel is going up against the community guest meet and greet, but at least you get to see one community guest here, so there you go. So this is a panel that I've been doing for a few years now. This is a special version that I do at PonyCons. If you saw the one that I did at Satterfest last year, it's on my YouTube channel. So if you are able to stay for the full panel, be sure to go and check out the one on my YouTube channel. If not, I am doing two panels back to back. So for the first hour, I am doing Cons Before and After Bronies. There is about a half-hour break, and afterwards I'm doing Inventing Transformative Art. That is more of a fan fiction art writing panel. Since this panel might run a little bit long, just because I have my two panels back to back, if it does run a little bit longer, it should be okay since my panel is right after. But before we begin, if you do have questions, try to save your questions towards the end or after I get through each portion of the slides, just so it saves a little bit of time. And we'll end with a video, so stick around for that. And after the video is over, I can take questions and answers. And if you have any more questions, I do have little flyers in the back. If not, if you do have a con book, if you turn to the very last page of the con book, my ad is there, and my ad will have a version of this timeline. So you're free to look at that. If you want a closer look at the timeline, just turn to the last page of the con book. So let's begin. I've been doing the convention history project for a few years now. In fact, I think this might be my 10th year doing it. I've realized that when you look at the history of fandoms, there's never really been a comprehensive history of all conventions. Most cons and most fandoms like to kind of classify their conventions in small categories, but no one's really looked at the larger family tree of conventions. I study genetic biology at Johns Hopkins University, so we kind of look at the evolution of organic organisms in a similar type of family tree, so I thought I'll apply the same model to the convention history project. So the timeline in your book in the con book is the one we'll be referring to, so it's color coordinated, so it's a little easier to identify the different communities. But the main thing is to show that bronies are not isolated from all the other communities out there. So comic cons, anime cons, furry cons are all part of this larger family tree. And we kind of forget about this, and I want to show how all these different cons are related. Since we're at a PonyCon, of course, we'll be talking about pony conventions. But aside from ponies, the Star Trek conventions are going to also be mentioned. And Star Trek and My Little Pony are really the only two franchise-specific conventions I'll talk about in this. And as you'll see, it's because they have played such a big impact on the overall convention volunteer scene. So let's begin. You can follow me on my Twitter at conhistory. You can contact me conhistory@gmail.com. Basically, anything that has conhistory, conhistory.com, conhistory on YouTube will be under me. So if you have any questions, you want to provide feedback, or even give me some of your information you think I might have missed out, feel free to contact me at these communications. So let's begin. So like I said, I've been working on my own little timeline for a while now. This is kind of a more recent breakdown I did to look at some of the different divisions of different conventions and some of the movements that kind of branched off or caused these different groups to reunite again. Mainly, we're going to be looking at the main branch. The main branch is going to be the science fiction branch. And I have to specify, science fiction, for the first part of the panel, is going to be basically the term we use in retrospect is speculative fiction. But when I say science fiction during this period, this includes fantasy, this includes horror, this includes comics, this includes animation. Because you remember, during this time period, science fiction was kind of the catch-all term for non-literary pop culture. So we're going to focus on the early science fiction conventions, but first we need to kind of focus on the bronies a bit. So we have bronies here in pink. They kind of pop up as kind of an interesting combination of the Star Trek and the furry conventions. And they really exploded for a period before dwindling, but we're going to talk about ponies for a bit. But first, I do have to mention the original My Little Pony convention, My Little Pony Fair. So this is closer to a toy show collecting convention. Toy show collections are very, very different from the pop culture cons that we have now. So basically, I'm going to use the term WorldCon model for when I talk about conventions, because the definition of convention is very tricky. It could be very, very broad. It's a Renaissance fair convention. It's a meetup a convention. It's a book signing a convention. So because of that, I'm using what I call the WorldCon model, and I'll explain what that is. The WorldCon model is essentially at least 2 or 3 days in a hotel venue or a convention center that deals with pop culture that I call narrative art pop culture. So any type of media that incorporates storytelling or visual art form. So this will be your comics, your anime, your furry communities, and science fiction. And I would say that these are very different from the toy collecting convention, but this is kind of the roots of the first My Little Pony conventions here, and it's still going strong. But we kind of want to talk about what we know as brony conventions. So the PonyCons have been around for over 10 years now, and of course there's some recognizable ones that we're here at Windy City, so there are a few cons that kind of still remain. But PonyCons have a big history, and you might recognize some of the names from over the years. But when I talk about Brony Convention, so uncapitalized, BronyCon is just my term it's just my genericized term for a convention specifically for Generation 4 of My Little Pony. So this is going to differentiate them from the pony toy collecting conventions that I was talking about earlier. But I do want to distinguish that's different from the capitalized BronyCon, which is a legal trademark for BronyCon. Same issue comes when you talk about Comic Cons, for example, because San Diego Comic Con has a trademark for Comic Con. But when we talk about Comic Cons, that is more of a genericized term. So let's begin. So the Brony fandom, I kind of divided at least the early period into different eras. So if you've seen the Brony history panel that I do with my friend Simo, who was the previous consul of Everfree Northwest, we talk a little bit about some of the different evolutions within the Brony fandom, and I kind of broke it down into different periods, but let me see if I could do it a little bit more clear here. So the early fandom, I would say, was kind of congregated online. This was through, of course, as we know, the pony fandom was kind of founded through the 4chan boards and heavily gathered on sites like Equestria Daily, DeviantArt, Tumblr, and YouTube. And this is where I would say this is the early period of the fandom, and this is where the visual content creators were kind of the most popular or most prominent members of the community during this period. So it makes sense because most of these communities, like Equestria Daily, were visual sites that would congregate different fan arts and stories during this period. So it was very, very visual mediums that we were looking at, and heavily concentrated online shareable visual mediums. Now, the next era I kind of like to talk about as the audio era, or the networking era, because this is the period when we started having the rise of pony podcasts. And so we had the formation of a lot of, I guess you could say, Brony media groups. So of course we have Everfree Network, we've had Cloudsdale Live, Ponyville Live, all these different groups that would stream. And of course, in between the podcasts, you'll need something to fill the time. This is where Brony musicians come into play. So I would say the big content creators over this period were the podcasters and the musicians. Now, the next era is when BronyCon really, really took off under Lunar Solace, and this is when conventions started growing. BronyCon was the first PonyCon to hit 10,000 attendance, and this was 2 years before the furries would even hit a similar number. So BronyCons really, really grew during this period, and this is where you get the YouTubers and the content creators and even the con cheers as kind of the big personalities during this fandom. Then we had the dipping off point where BronyCon attendance kind of dropped, kind of pun intended, the Twilight era, right before it kind of ended, because this is by coincidence the BronyCon and G4 of My Little Pony ended the same year, 2019. And that was right before the pandemic hit, so that shifted to the next period, which is the post G4 era, which is kind of the online era, and now we're in a new generation. So these are kind of the just really simplistic breakdowns of the different communities, which I guess we could break down a little bit further. So like I said, the first period was kind of a visual period, and this is where we would get the different formations and groups of the community. So to talk about the fandom during this period, it was kind of odd that a lot of the public would point out, isn't it odd that adult men are interested in the show for little girls and whatnot, the entire story. So to kind of circumvent this, a lot of people started to like the show. They said they liked the show in an ironic fashion. So to kind of mask their love of MOP, they will post ironic memes as a way to kind of say, hey, yeah, I like it, but I like it for the meme culture, I like it for the fun. So you kind of see different types of stories and creations emerge during this period. So of course, to give credit to the term brony was actually coined on 4chan. So you can see in that the thread on the far right, person says, was asking for a picture of Spike, said, perfect, thanks a lot, Pony Bro, and then next person said, Pony Bro, more like brony, am I right? And that's just where we get the first time the term brony was coined. So like I said, a lot of meme culture. So what you would see with ponies during this period is one or two things. One, like I said, you would have like kind of the more memey stuff. Or two, you would contrast ponies, which is a cute, happy show made for kids, with the exact opposite. So this is where you mash My Little Pony up with things that are grimdark, more adult, more horror-filled. So good examples of this would include like mashing them up with more adult fictions. So of course we have ponies with Watchmen's, ponies with Fallout, of course giving birth to the Fall Equestria series. You would have more grimdark stuff like Cupcakes and Rainbow Factory. And of course you would have ponies mashed up with adult humor, like with Friendship is Witchcraft or the Apple Dot Move series made by Hot Diggity Demon. So you kind of see ponies kind of represent this ironic sense, but of course we really do love ponies for just being a great show as it is. So during that time you kind of see the people who kind of like to ironically either disappear or become incorporated, and then you have kind of the more hardcore fans remaining. And of course the local news media would pick up on this, and this is the same pattern we'll see over and over again. When we look at the formation of the Star Trek fandom and Star Trek cons, you would see the local media also poking fun at Star Trek fans. In the 90s, when the furries and furry cons came about, the same thing happened. So it was no surprise bronies also got a lot of coverage from the media as well. But like I said, there was a bunch of different groups that was trying to kind of classify and catalog and keep the entire community kind of united. And it made sense that the bronies were kind of born in this era of social media networking, that we would have different groups trying to compete for it. Because if you look at some of the other fandoms, like for example the furry fandom, you kind of have Uncle Kage as kind of the unofficial figurehead of the furry community. And for a period, Equestria Daily under Sophisto was kind of like that, but you saw a lot of other people wanting to get in on that and become like the new figurehead of the brony fandom during this period. And we got really the formation of a bunch of different news groups, Dirty News, When They Go Live, Free Network, Celeste Radio, for example. And like I said, this is where a lot of different podcasts came about. So Sandy and Apple Cider would actually help with the formation of Nightmare Nights Dallas. Of course, this is where Dusty Cat really got popular during this period as well. And of course, Pegasisters, Pegasister being kind of the counter to Brony. Pegasister was coined, and we have Pegasisters Live as one of the more popular female-centric run podcasts during this period. And like I said, in between the podcasts, what you put is audio medium. This is where you get a lot of the musicians. And a lot of these musicians you might recognize if you're outside the brony fandom as well, because they kind of succeeded outside the brony community as well. But a lot of these individuals, like Living Tombstone, like The Microphone, Your Beat Brony, Silverhound, all kind of got their start doing brony music. And now they're doing furry and anime cons. And some of them, like Living Tombstone, even going on to do bigger concerts. Now, during the period when brony cons and the convention scene really started to explode, we started to see a bunch of different convention-specific culture. So things like Twilight Secret Shipfic became really, really popular around this time period, and it kind of was like the Cards Against Humanity for the brony fandom. If you go to any PonyCon during this period, you'll see at least someone at an empty table playing that game with a group of their friends. It will be very, very common at room parties to play with. Even Bob's Burgers kind of poked fun at My Little Pony, accurately recreating the Baltimore Convention Center, I must say, with their with their Equesticos episode. So yes, but we're here specifically about for the conventions. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the conventions. But first, we need to get to the what I would call the proto-conventions, and these are the meetups. So like I said, there's a distinguishing line between meetups and conventions, and I would say because conventions have to be in some hotel or convention center venue, with people at least coming from around the world staying overnight. Most meetups were one-day events, but meetup.com was probably the site where most of these local bronies would meet and would form the foundation for actually becoming conventions. So you saw, before BronyCon was even formed as the first PonyCon, you saw a lot of different groups who had the potential to kind of become the first pony conventions. So you had a group in Seattle who eventually became Evergreen Northwest. You had a group in Ohio which eventually became TrotCon, and of course you had a New York group run by Purple Tinker who would eventually become BronyCon. But before we could get specifically to the conventions, let's go back to where these cons came from to begin with, because if we can't really talk about the history of conventions, we really can't understand why these BronyCons came the way they did and what elements they incorporated. So first, let's get started with the golden age of science fiction. By an interesting coincidence, the golden age of science fiction also starts the same year the golden age of comics do. So when we think of conventions, we think of science fiction, we think of the comics. So the fact that 1938 is kind of the start of the golden age for both of these different fandoms kind of makes sense. But it was the science fiction fans who were the first to kind of create their own conventions. So we have to look at this period. This took place right after the Great Depression. So you had a really, really different environment of people growing up. After the Great Depression, finally cars are coming back. We have a lot of fan groups meeting. But most specifically, this is a period where pop culture literature, pop culture magazines, science fiction magazines, like I said, science fiction was the catch-all general term that included space opera, fantasy, sword and sorcery were all under this larger umbrella of science fiction during this time before it was split up. So you had this genre, science fiction, that was not really receiving the same treatment from literary critics as the older literary novels. So you had a lot of science fiction fans really wanting to honor the writers and artists who were working in these science fiction zines, and they decided to form their first early conventions to kind of show their appreciation for this. Now, a lot of the communication during this time was done through fanzines. Fanzines were little kind of mail-in pamphlets that you would receive by mail, where you could receive letters or kind of communicate with other fans. So you could see this as the early version of what Twitter, social media, and even web forums were. Basically snail mail communications with their fans, and it was through these zines that they decided to organize the first science fiction meetups. Now, when you look at some of the early science fiction gatherings, because you could even trace a lot of these fan gatherings to the Victorian era, but when we look at the ones that eventually became the conventions, we can kind of look at this list. Now, if you ask most old school science fiction fans, so specifically the Worldcon attending crowd, most of them will say the choice between what the first convention is between these two events. PhilCon, also known as the First Eastern Conference in 1939, is considered the first science fiction convention by a lot of these fans because it was the first one held. But the first one that was planned to be organized was the first British conference, also known as the Leeds event, which was held the next year, so it was planned before then. But when I asked them, well, why do you consider these two the first con when you don't consider the first Science Fiction League meeting, which had basically the exact same number of attendants? They had about 10 attendees at all these different events, but it took course over the place of 2 days, so at least it was a 2-day event. And they said, well, we don't consider the first Science Fiction League meeting a con because it doesn't have the term conference or convention in its title, and at that point it's kind of all semantics. So that's why I don't specifically use their definitions for my definition of convention, and I like to choose this one. And most people outside the science fiction community will consider Worldcon, or the first Worldcon convention, as the first true pop culture convention. That's why I say, when I talk about conventions, I say a Worldcon style convention, because it's a very, very specific definition. First, it took place over the course of 3 days, July 4th weekend. Second, it had over 100 confirmed attendees. So these two things, I would say, automatically start to distinguish it from some of the other science fiction meetings that came before. So here's an early program, and this is the next factor which I would use to distinguish them from these different events. Because as opposed to doing just meetings, this was an organized event with set programming and set panels. Now, during these early days, you basically only had one panel room and one paneling happening at the same time. So you didn't have multiple panels like we do now. Everyone was assumed to go to the same panels. They would have screenings of some science fiction movies, but this is a place where people would gather. So Worldcon, held in New York, and it's going to be interesting because the first pony convention, GronyCon, was also held in New York. The first Star Trek Con was also held in New York. The first Comic Con was also held in New York. So New York seems to be the birthplace of a lot of these different conventions. Now, Worldcon got its name from the World's Fair that was happening in New York during this period. And actually, very similar to the World's Fair, because the World's Fair is hosted by different countries every year. Worldcon is a convention that's not specifically situated in any one city. It could be held anywhere around the world. Most often it's held in the United States, but basically different science fiction clubs of different cities would put in their bids to host the next year's Worldcon. Now you can vote 2 years in advance, and normally a lot of these voting periods are done during the room parties. So basically different cities will set up their own con suite and have their own room party, and whoever had the best room party normally was the one the attendees will vote for to host next year's Worldcon. So we already have some of the elements. So like I said, it's a multi-day event. It also has its first guest of honor, and this is a tradition that most cons will continue, having one guest of honor. So the science fiction conventions will have one guest of honor from the professional sphere, so someone who was published in a science fiction magazine or got their novel published. And then you'll have one fan guest of honor. This is sometimes a fan fiction writer or fan artist. The Brony convention scene has a very similar tradition. So basically we have the guest of honor track, which are for people who worked on the show or the official IDW comics, and then we have community guests, and you can see the community guests as being the equivalent to the fan guest of honor that these early science fiction cons had. So basically everything we could kind of associate with conventions, we could trace to Worldcon, including things like badges and lanyards and all your ribbons, room parties, the art show, the dealers, all this stuff we could trace to Worldcon, which we can't trace to any of these other cons that a lot of science fiction fans claim is the first, which is why I say Worldcon is my definition of the first convention by my model, and this is why I say I'm using the Worldcon model to see every con later. Also, funny enough, I could even trace the first Dead Dog party to the first Worldcon. So Dead Dog is a term that's kind of used for sometimes the last panel of the con, sometimes the feedback panel, sometimes used for the last dance of the con, called the Dead Dog Dance, but oftentimes it's used for a last party of the con, often thrown by the con staff after everything wraps up, and this is known as a Dead Dog party, and the very first Dead Dog was held 4 days after Worldcon, July 8th, at Mort Weisinger's house, so we could even trace down the exact staffer who held that first Dead Dog party. The term Dead Dog was slang during this period for empty liquor bottles, so that's where we get the term Dead Dog. Now, Worldcon, what's interesting is one of the attendees of the first Worldcon in the zine wanted to draw his experience, so he drew on the cover of this Worldcon issue of the zine a long line for the badge pickup. And as you know, if you've been to a lot of cons, and whether it's a Comic Con, an Anime Con, a Furry Con, or even Pony Con, badge pickup lines don't change. So, this was over 80 years ago, and this was at Worldcon last year. So, you're always going to wait for your badge. Even at the very first convention, this tradition has not changed. Now, it is the second Worldcon in Chicago that started to formulate a lot of other elements that we now associate with conventions. So first, Chicago was actually one that was heavily involved with cosplay. So the first cosplay would trace back to the first Worldcon. Forrest Ackerman, a science fiction editor, dressed up in space opera uniform based on one of the stories he was representing with his girlfriend during the time. So cosplay became really big at the second Worldcon, and this is actually where we get the first costume masquerade, because remember, the term cosplay wouldn't be coined until the 80s. So, but dressing up in costumes of pop culture characters was big during this period. So the first costume masquerade is basically it's basically the big event Saturday night where people would make their own unique costumes and walk on stage, sometimes do a skit, sometimes dance to music. And we could see the roots to the cosplay gala, the cosplay contest, and if you go to furry cons, the fursuit parade, all kind of descended from this early costume masquerade. The other thing is, this is also where we get the first con suite. And con suite are very important, so we look at two different types of con suites, the ones that eventually form the room parties, and the ones that become the hospitality suites at cons. So most cons kind of now disregard this, but if you still go to an old school science fiction convention, you weren't an attendee of these science fiction conventions, you were a paying member. And your membership came with access to a con suite, which would basically have free food and drinks that technically your membership paid for. So basically, the entire weekend, open 24 hours, there'll just be free food and drinks in this con suite where you can kind of rest up. Sometimes it's done potluck style, you could bring your own food, and oftentimes it's pizza, and they would have a soda fountain working. Some cons kind of have in the like a later evolution of this. If you go to a furry con, you would have the zoo. The zoo is kind of the equivalent of the con suite. It just, most zoos disregard the food element now. You can even say the maid cafe at some anime cons might be an equivalent of this. But the next important thing is filking. This is what we call filk music or fanish music. The term filk was actually coined in the 50s, a type of folk. But the filk music has been around since the very first World Con. Now, the first World Con was held in New York, like I said, and there was a group of science fiction fans in New York called the Futurians. The Futurians were very, very active in a lot of the socialist scenes during this period. Again, this was after the Great Depression, so they would often go to union protests and sing protest music. Now, during the first World Con, they would go and sing their protest songs there as well. Over time, the words to some of these protest songs were lost, so people started making up their own lyrics to a lot of these songs of their favorite pop culture characters like Flash Gordon, Superman, even Star Trek. And this is where we get the evolution of fan music, fanish music, which has been played a prominent role in the convention scene since this period. Now, oftentimes, you would go to basically an empty panel room like this, and someone might bring their guitar and start playing music, and this is where we get the people singing along. Most conventions, like I said, were held in a hotel before everyone started moving to convention centers. So find every single hotel in the lobby normally has a piano. Someone will go up to the piano and start playing music. People will gather around in a circle, and this is basically what filk music is. So these are impromptu fan music, and you have to remember, this is before cons had organized concerts and dances. So this is where your music came from. Fan-made music that just happened to spring up organically in empty panel rooms in the lobbies. And you can kind of think about how a lot of proto-cons have this. Someone might randomly start singing a song from the show and everyone joins in. Someone might be rocking around for ukulele, people join in. But you could kind of see the Renegade stage is also a kind of an evolution of this, where musicians who are not on the official concert list could go to the Renegade stage and play. So this is where we kind of get the evolution of a lot of filk music. Now, when we get to the Silver Age, this is where we kind of get to the birth of a lot of new different things. So the Silver Age of comics starts in the early 1960s, and this is coincidentally where the science fiction golden age also ends and kind of is replaced by new wave science fiction. And this is where we kind of get the split between science fiction as the hard space genre that we kind of know now, and what we call high fantasy or epic fantasy that was kind of popularized by J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy. But specifically for the comic cons, you had a lot of fans of these comic fans go to these science fiction cons, because remember, science fiction cons were the catch-all pop culture cons of its day. So if you were a science fiction fan or a comic book fan, you would go to these comic conventions. But now the comic fandom is especially getting more and more popular now that superheroes are in a revival at both DC and Marvel Comics. Now, comics also had their own fanzines, and in one of the zines, they basically said the comic fandom will not be a fandom in its own right until we had a convention. So you had some high school kids basically start the first comic book convention. It was a one-day event. They only had probably 6 dealer tables, and that was it, held for 6 hours. Happened in New York, and it was called New York Comic Con. And most comic historians will say this is the very first Comic Con of any type. Now, the Comic Con introduced a new element to the scene, and this would basically be called the Artist Alley. Because we have to remember, for most of this period, the science fiction cons only had one professional guest of honor. Comic Cons kind of wanted to attract a lot of people, so how do we have a lot of fantastic writers and artists, how do we bring them to the con? Well, we could probably let them have a table, and at the table, they could sell their original art, they could do commissions, they could do autograph signings, and we don't have to pay for their hotel or flights. We could just kind of convince them to come to the cons, and boom, you get the birth of the first type of artist alley, because the term artist alley will be used 3 different times, and it means 3 completely different things. So I'm going to specify this as the industry artist alley or the Comic-Con style artist alley. So you had a lot of kids who grew up with these science fiction cons, and they would go on to form a lot of these Comic Cons. So for example, Sheldorf and some other individuals who grew up as kids would move to San Diego in 1970, and this is where we get the birth of Golden State Comic Con, now known as San Diego Comic Con. So in Japan, you start seeing something very, very similar. You would see a lot of comic book creators, also known as doujinshi artists, or doujin. These are basically short little fan-made comics, and they would sell these comics at these science fiction cons in Japan. Eventually, there will be so many of these doujinshi artists selling that they eventually spun them off and basically made their own little event. And this is where we get the birth of Comic Market, also known as Comic Kit. Comic Kit is essentially one giant artist alley. So when we think of cons now, we think of a show floor, we think of panels, we think of concerts, we think of the cosplay contests, all this stuff. Comic Con is essentially just one giant artist alley. That's it. And it's one giant artist alley where people sell doujinshi, which basically is like 99% of it is like adult comics. So that's the way to summarize it. A lot of people say, why is modern fandom so adult in its materials? Like, no, it's been around since the beginning of fandom. Like, that's something that happens. So doujinshi actually takes from a tradition that's very similar to something we had in America called the Tijuana Bible. But I would say doujinshi is very similar to what we are during this period to the zine culture that's happening in America during this period. So you have a lot of zines that were published, especially during the 60s and 70s with a lot of underground comic groups, and some of them would have anthropomorphic characters. And we could kind of see the roots of a lot of the modern furry fandom evolved from fans of these specific anthropomorphic zines. So here's some example of doujinshi. So I found a Japanese one of My Little Pony. So this is an example of what doujinshi is, short little fan-made comics using a lot of popular characters. And this is where we get the birth of the second type of artist alley. Again, the first type, the Comic-Con style, are people who actually work on the official DC and Marvel comics, so they're legally allowed to sell that art. The second time are all fan-made artists selling fan art, which technically is a gray area. But for the first period, you have these 2 different types of artist alleys existing across the oceans, completely separate now. But it's when the anime cons come to America, that's when we'll start seeing the problems. But we're not there yet. But like I said, doujinshi culture was really, really big. Here's some photos from Comic Con throughout the years. So it's crazy, but this con is 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic Con, which we kind of think as one of the biggest here in America. But not only is it 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic Con, it's held twice a year. So just imagine a giant artist alley 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic Con, held twice a year. So that's something. All right. So we are going to look at this period. So I have science fiction kind of in blue, but you're going to see a light blue section kind of pop up in that science fiction branch. And this is where we get to the first of our franchise-specific fandoms. This is where we get to the Star Trek fans, also known as the Trekkies. So Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, announced his first, he's working on a new show called Star Trek at Worldcon. Obviously it was the right audience. Basically he's doing what Warner Brothers and Disney does now at Comic-Con, and that's where we're working on a new superhero movie. Gene Roddenberry was doing that decades ahead with Star Trek. The first, after the original series ended, you still had a big collection of Star Trek fans, so they decided to basically go to a lot of these science fiction conventions. The problem is, now you have the old guard science fiction fans being overwhelmed by these young kids who are fans of this new hit show called Star Trek that they know nothing about. And like I said, the problem is there is only one panel room and one panel happening at the same time. So now all of a sudden you get a bunch of Star Trek panels filling up the panel slots, and a lot of the old science fiction fans are not too interested. So after 40 years of running one panel at the same time, the cons got the brilliant idea of saying, oh, we could hold more than one panel at once. And boom, we get the birth of what we call the multi-track programming, or the programming track. So the programming track basically divides all the panel. first of all, you have more than one panel room, so you have multiple panel rooms, and oftentimes the panel rooms will be themed to a specific topic. So you might have a writing panel room, which is the writing track. You might have a cosplay panel room. You might have a panel room for fantasy stories, a panel room for fan fiction writing. And this is where we kind of get the modern idea of con panels now. That's why we have so many panels on the list, so people can pick and choose the different ones. But still, the Star Trek fans kind of overwhelm these science fiction cons, so they decide to form their own Star Trek con. Star Trek Lives in New York. The first year had 3,000 attendees, which is really, really big, because even big pony cons don't really hit that number anymore. And if you even think about furry cons, you rarely see any furry cons even have more than 1,000 attendees its first year. So the fact that the first Star Trek con was big is kind of crazy. The second year, its number doubled to be 6,000 attendees, and by the third year, it had 15,000 attendees. So here's like the first 3 years of Star Trek Lives. In blue is Worldcon, the first convention, and in red is San Diego Comic-Con. So you can see right out of the door, the Star Trek conventions already was beating the oldest and largest conventions during this period. But kind of like the Brony fandom later, we saw all these Star Trek cons kind of hit a peak and then start dwindling down. So what happened when these Star Trek cons started to dwindle? Well, a lot of these Star Trek cons are really well run, and they introduce a lot of elements that we associate with cons now. So like I said, the multi-track programming, you had expanded dealers halls where people will sell Star Trek memorabilia, signed autographs, signed photos. Zine culture was popular during this period, especially with the emergence of shipping and slash fiction. This is where you take normally two canonically heterosexual male characters on the show and put them into a gay romantic relationship during this period. It's Primo, so appropriate to mention this. So you have a lot of different elements developed at a lot of these Star Trek conventions. And these Star Trek cons were so well run that even though the Star Trek cons were kind of dwindling in attendance, they decided to kind of keep the shell that they had and basically pivot into the new type of convention, the multimedia conventions. And this is where the branch will shift from science fiction cons kind of being the branch of the general pop culture convention to now these former Star Trek cons as multimedia conventions being now the new branch of the general pop culture convention. But because of that, when most TV, media, comics, whenever they want to represent or kind of poke fun at a convention, is often in the form of poking fun at Trekkies, because Trekkies in the convention scene were so synonymous during this period. It wouldn't be until Comic-Con kind of becomes popular again in the mid-2000s that we kind of separate this image of the nerdy Star Trek fan and the convention scene. Alright, so let's go back to this branch here, because we're going to look at this very interesting branch right here, because you'll notice that the American anime cons and furry cons come from a very specific branch that comes off of the science fiction con scene, and it's specifically the Cartoon Fantasy organization that's kind of the grandfather of both conventions here in the United States. The Cartoon Fantasy organization was a group that kind of organized the viewing and screening of anime in America. We have to remember during this time period, anime was not really popular or really dubbed or distributed in America. Sometimes some animation will have some test runs in the West Coast, in Hawaii and California. Oftentimes it wasn't dubbed or subbed, and it'll only run once and that's it. So a lot of these fans would record anime, which was then not even used as a term. The term was Japanimation during this period. So you have a lot of fans record these Japanimation shows and distribute them on VHSs to college and high school anime clubs across the country, and to different science fiction clubs and science fiction conventions where they'll be shown in panel rooms and even watch that during room parties. The organizers of these groups, Fred Patton and Mark Milano, were both considered they're both the founders of the Cartoon Fantasy organization, and kind of considered the founders or the fathers of both the anime fandom here in America and furry fandom. So it's interesting that when we kind of think of the furry and anime fandoms as two really completely separate things now, but at least for a period, they would acknowledge basically the exact same founders for their respective communities. And the Cartoon Fantasy organization would use this mascot, anthropomorphic animal, which was an alien space weasel called a Skeletor, as kind of their de facto mascot. So let's talk about how cons were done during this period. So when I talk about conventions, science fiction, like I said, was the catch-all pop culture convention during the day. So if you were a fan of a specific community, how would you meet up with your like-minded science fiction fans? And that becomes a little tricky. So what most cons would have nowadays are meetups, specific meetups. So at anime cons, you will have meetups for your specific favorite anime. At furry cons, you might have meetups for your specific species or persona. So at most early science fiction cons, you would have this giant bulletin board in the lobby where people will write their room number, what fandom they're a part of, and what time period they will be having a party. So for example, if you were a Doctor Who fan and you wanted to meet up with different Doctor Who fans at your con, you'll probably write Doctor Who fans meet in Hyatt 204 at 8 p.m. and will watch some Tom Baker episodes. And this is where you get how different fan groups at this large event could meet up together. And this is where we get the formation of the room party and room party floor. And the room party floor is a staple at almost every single science fiction con now still, and still a staple at a lot of old school furry cons. And what's interesting about that is this is where we get the formation of a lot of conventions. Like the birth of the anime cons and the furry cons, you could argue, came from these room parties. In fact, this is a very old bulletin board that's been passed down Worldcon to Worldcon. That bulletin board might be the very same one that gave birth to the furry fandom as we know it. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at the history of most pony conventions were founded by people who had experience running anime or furry cons. However, there is only one Brony convention that was started by people who had a connection to the science fiction scene, and that's BabsCon, the Bay Area Brony Spectacular, through BayCon, which was a local science fiction community that also played a role in Further Confusion in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's interesting that BabsCon is the only pony convention that's connected to the science fiction convention scene, because BabsCon was also, for the longest time, the only pony convention to also have that bulletin board in the lobby of the hotel where people could post their room parties on. So once you see the DNA of these different cons, you kind of point out, oh, that's where that element came from. So now Everfree kind of does this as well, but for the longest time, it was only BabsCon. All right. So let's go back to the anime cons and the furry cons. So if we go back to the anime cons wouldn't really be formed until the 90s, but during the 80s you would have these small anime fan meetups, small fan events. And this is where we'll have people play kind of these bootleg, illegally recorded VHSs of animes and show them at college campuses or at these different science fiction room parties. But because they weren't translated and they weren't dubbed or subbed during this period, you'll often have interpreters stand in front of the TV and kind of explain everything that was happening. Sometimes they'll also receive a printout of kind of breaking down the characters and a rough estimation of the plot. Oftentimes these weren't well translated, but people kind of got the interpretation. What people really liked was kind of the flashy action and battle scenes of these anime. So a lot of people will try to represent that emotion that they saw in the anime by pairing it with music. So you'll have a lot of cuts of different anime episodes paired with different emotional toned music songs, and boom, you get the birth of the anime music video, or the AMV, which becomes a very, very big part of anime culture here in America, especially with the birth of anime cons. In fact, you go to most anime cons, you'll still have AMV showings and AMV contests. Now, it's interesting, the first few anime cons, the groups that claim to be the first anime cons all seem like coincidence to happen in Dallas, but that might make sense because there was a large Dallas anime fan group. And in fact, if you look at most anime dubbing done in America, it's either done in Los Angeles or Dallas, so it kind of makes sense. Dallas might have been the hub of some of the early anime communities. The first convention to specifically reference anime as part of their scene was the Dallas Fan Fair in 1982. The ModelCon was the first one-day anime con, which was essentially a dealer's hall in a hotel. But the first, what I would say, the Worldcon model anime con, so the combo hotel dealer programming style, I would say is A-Con, also held in the Radisson Hotel in 1990. So A-Con, still happening today in Dallas, Texas, you could say is kind of the first 3-day anime con here in America. Most anime fans in America would consider it the first anime convention. However, AnimeCon in 1991 was kind of the big one held in San Jose, and it was the first to break 1,000 attendees. AnimeCon would rebrand as Anime Expo, and Anime Expo eventually moved to Los Angeles, and Anime Expo is now still the largest anime con here in America. Now, the AnimeCon started to import a lot of different elements from their Japanese counterparts. Specifically, they were the first to bring concerts and dances, Japanese-style raves here to America. So if you look at the point, before then, aside from folk music, there was really no organized music at these conventions. There's no concerts, no dances. It was really with AnimeCons bringing that style from Japan here to America that now we got the inclusion of concerts. In fact, if you look at almost every single type of con that was formed before the formation of anime cons in the 90s. So if you look at your comic cons and science fiction cons, there are no concerts or no dances at these events. But if you look at all the cons that were formed after anime cons came to America, the furry and brony cons, for example, they all have concerts and dances. So you can again kind of see new elements these cons are bringing in that then will influence the cons that formed later. And like I said, they will bring the comic head style of artist alley here as well. So let's go back to the Prancing Scale Terror. Now that the anime cons are kind of their own thing, the purpose of the Cartoon Fantasy organization, which was to organize these anime viewings, no longer had that purpose anymore. But there was a bunch of fans who were still remaining who were fans of anthropomorphic anime characters and anthropomorphic cartoons. So they decided to throw some of their own parties based around this. And the Prancing Scale Terror was kind of the name of the home, the furry household, and the mascot of the organization was used as the name of these parties. So the Prancing Scale Terror Party at WesternCon in 1985 was known as the first funny animal party because this was before the term furry was coined. But essentially, it was the first furry party. And it's through these furry parties we kind of start to get the formation of what we now know as the furry fandom and the furry convention scene. So these furry parties would grow so big, eventually the organizers of the Prancing Scale Terror decided to organize the first convention conference in 1989. So if we say A-Con is the first anime con in America, then technically the first furry con in America was formed a year beforehand, and thus the furry cons might have predated the anime cons here in America. Conference was held in 1985 and they had 65 attendees, so a bit small, but it specifically incorporated a lot of elements that were taken directly from the science fiction convention scene. So it took the hotel room rate model, it took the staffing model, it took the party floor, it took the programming track, it took the long badge pickup line, it took the art show, a lot of these different elements, which is interesting because furries were actually the most tech savvy of these con organizers during this period. But of course, as we know, the furries were also kind of attacked and misaligned, so the furries kind of isolated themselves for a period. So while all these different cons, the anime cons, the comic cons, the science fiction cons, would often share the same group of volunteers, most of the furry cons would only take volunteers from their own small circle and kind of refuse outside help. In fact, most of the furry cons would start to blacklist media during this period and blacklist anyone who is associated with the media or talks to media or takes pictures and gives them to the media. So the furry fandom from the 90s till the late 2000s would kind of be its own isolated bubble. And because of that, it kept all these old 80s and 90s science fiction models of running conventions and kind of never evolved past this, which is interesting because, like I said, the furries are kind of the most tech savvy. They were the ones who created some fantastic VR online virtual conventions. But when you go to a furry con, so for example, the last 3 cons of the panels at were all furry cons. At the last 3 furry cons, I did not have a projector in the room, there was no staff to help me with a projector, and there was no breaks in between panels, and there was no staff to declare the room. This is a science fiction style of running cons, which kind of makes sense because science fiction cons are a few hundred to maybe the low thousand attendees. But when you have furry cons that are now hitting 4,000, 5,000, 10,000 attendees, having that model doesn't work. If no one's clearing the rooms, then that means the next panel will start late. If there's no one to help set up projectors, then the panels will run late. And I had that issue with the last 3 cons I did panels at, and they were all furry cons. So it's interesting that while a lot of furry cons are kind of evolving and progressing and modernizing this, a lot of them are still stuck in running this model. Likewise, the anime cons are also stuck in their specific Comic Con style model for running Artist Alley. I was just at Anime Central 2 weeks ago here in Chicago as well. And that con, there was no gaps between the tables. All the Artist Alley tables were all back to back, and it was like horrendous, like it's a fire hazard. But that's how anime cons did for a long time. And you'll start seeing this. Once a con is used to something, doesn't matter how big they grow, they get stuck in these old models of running things and kind of fail to evolve, which is something I think most cons should start taking notice of. So, furry cons. Anime cons and comic cons all basically adapted stuff from these early science fiction cons. So the hotel room block model is a big one, the programming track. Some things would change that way. So furry cons still kind of keep the one guest of honor model. And I'll explain later, anime cons and comic cons kind of got rid of this and kind of went through their own thing. Some of the interesting thing I want to talk about, the cosplay masquerade was normally the big event at the science fiction cons Saturday evening. When the furries basically did their own equivalent of a fursuit masquerade, they decided to move it to Saturday afternoon. But because of that, that means the dealers didn't have a chance to see these fantastic fursuiters during this period. So after the masquerade, they'll normally march all the fursuiters through the dealer's hall, and this is where we get the birth of the fursuit parade. And nowadays, most furry cons no longer even have a fursuit masquerade, but they now have the fursuit parade still. So that's where it came from. Alright, so the next major one is Conference East. So what's interesting is the term conference was a genericized term for FurryCon during this period. So Conference East had no relationship to the original conference, but that was a genericized term, so that's what they used. It eventually fell and was replaced by Albany Anthrocon. Albany Anthrocon chose Dr. Conway, also known as Uncle Kage, to be its guest of honor, and Uncle Kage left as the chairman of the first con and has been the chair of Anthrocon since then, and kind of kept a lot of the same models. He initially moved it to his hometown in Philadelphia. It was known as StairCon because the elevator was broken, so everyone had to use the stairs. But essentially, almost every single con since then has kind of become a stair or elevator con because the elevators always break. You go to any con, elevator normally has one that's broken, long line. Some furry cons, if you go to a furry con that's held in a hotel, it might take like 2 hours just to wait the elevator to go back up. So it's kind of crazy. He eventually moved Anthrocon to Pittsburgh, and that's where it remains to this day. It's greatly helped the city of Pittsburgh. There's a very close relationship with Anthrocon and Pittsburgh. Another thing Uncle Kage did was try to make the fandom a little bit more family friendly, try to incorporate more, tried to make it more accessible to the public. So what was called the pet auction, which was a charity at that time, was renamed into a charity auction. And Anthrocon was the largest furry con for the longest time. It was the first to break 5,000 attendees, then later broke 100. But then Midwest Fur Fest in 2018 was the first furry con to break 10,000 attendees. But that's interesting because sometimes the furries like to claim bronies as their own and claim, oh, all bronies are technically furries. Well, if that's the case, that means BronyCon is a furry con, and BronyCon was technically then the first furry con to break 10,000 attendees. So they want to say that that's what happened. But let's talk a little bit about the 90s. So during the same time period, you had what's called the comics crash and boom during the 90s, you had the animation renaissance during the 90s, and you had this entire culture of these different corporations wanting to buy up conventions. And this is where we get to shift from the volunteer-run fan cons to the more pro-corporate cons, where you had these big businesses buying up previously fan-run volunteer cons. The first major one is Fan Expo Canada, which started to acquire different conventions. Fan Expo Canada, for example, bought Dallas Comic Con and renamed it to Fan Expo Dallas, so that's where you kind of get a lot of these Fan Expo cons from. Wizard Magazine, which used to list comic book prices, bought Chicago Comic Con, one of the oldest comic cons in the country, and renamed it as Wizard World Chicago. And this is where you get the entire Wizard World name of cons. Coincidentally, Fan Expo was eventually acquired by Informa, and they later also bought Wizard World, so all these different con groups eventually got rebought up by different ones. But this is where we see the shift in Comic-Con becoming very, very popular, because up to this point, you could still go to Comic-Con the day of and buy a ticket and go in. Nowadays, if you try to go to Comic-Con, tickets sell out within seconds online. If you try to get a ticket, they're normally gone within 10 seconds. So possibly get a ticket to San Diego Comic-Con. And there's no reason why it's explicitly stated why Comic-Con became so popular, but I have a few theories. My theory is specifically Iron Man and the Dark Knight coming out the same year, revitalizing interest in superheroes, but specifically they had big name actors attached to these roles who were now announced their projects at Comic-Con. So when you think about most actors going to these events, for the longest period, most of these conventions, science fiction, horror, fantasy conventions, will normally have an area where you have B-list, C-list, D-list actors do autograph signings. This is informally called the Celebrity Zoo. Basically, it's kind of like, most cons have an artist alley, most cons will have a Celebrity Zoo area where you have different people signing autographs. But now you have an A-list actor, Robert Downey Jr., going to San Diego Comic-Con announcing, hey, I'm working on Iron Man. And I think that shifts things, for now the general public, who normally can't interact with A-list celebrities, are able to go to these events and start interacting with them. Paired with the rise of a lot of these pop culture franchises, and boom, I think it kind of makes sense that Comic-Con shifts from something that used to be kind of considered nerdy by the public, specifically for comic book collectors, to now being this big pop culture influence where now geek is chic and everyone's wanting to go to these conventions. And you see around the same time period things like Funko Pop, Loungefly, Loot Crate, all these different groups trying to capitalize on geek culture. And it all kind of happened during this period. So that's just my theory. I haven't seen any writing on this specifically, but that's my theory for why it kind of became popular during this period. And you start seeing a lot of groups specifically try to run these conventions as a for-profit professional thing. So not only did you have Wizard World Fan Expo, you had Creation, which was the early attempt in the 70s to professionally run Star Trek conventions, but nowadays it's more dominated by Repop and Left Field Media and Informa. Interesting enough, the two founders of New York Comic Con, one of them ended up working for Repop, the other one went and started formed his own company called Left Field Media, which started Awesome Con. And what's interesting is in the Pacific Northwest, you had two fan-run comic conventions, Emerald City Comic Con in Seattle and Rose City Comic Con in Portland. Well, Repop bought Emerald City and Left Field Media bought Rose City. And then when they wanted to start working on their own anime cons, Repop partnered up with Crunchyroll to make Crunchyroll Expo, while Left Field decided to make Anime NYC and Anime Frontier powered by Crunchyroll. So it's this weird, incestuous copycatting of these two former founders of New York Comic Con, which I think is kind of interesting. And I do want to point out, New York Comic Con under Repop is a completely separate organization from that first New York Comic Con I was talking about. So let's go back to this chart because we want to get back to where the bronies are, right here. So we're going to get back into the brony section. It looks like I'm running out of time, but like I said, because my panel is next, I get to run over a little bit. So we have the first BronyCon in New York City, and over time, a lot of the PonyCons started branching out, expanding, to the point you had at least 30 PonyCons happening a year in the United States alone, which is crazy when you think about it. There was more pony conventions happening in the United States than there were Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, Harry Potter conventions happening together, combined. So it's kind of crazy that the pony convention scene just kind of exploded. And I think it has to do with a lot of the online community, because the online community shortened the time that fans could communicate. Like I said, fans were communicating through mail and zine culture during this period. Now that they communicate faster through online social media, it made sense that the Brony fandom and thus the BronyCons really, really explode on the scene. So, in honor of Pride Month, I want to talk about the founder, Purple Tinker, a trans individual, and we'll point out that the Brony fandom is heavily trans influenced. Almost every single founder of a pony convention or a con-chair of a pony convention has been a trans individual, oftentimes trans female, which is interesting because when the fandom first started, everyone says it was adult men. But when you think about it, a lot of these adult men turned out to be trans female. So you know what? It might not be adult men. It might be a lot of trans females who were originally part of this original community. And because of that, the trans part of the fandom has played a big role in how these conventions were shaped. So you had a lot of strong, cosplay consent laws enacted, rules enacted. You had the the popularity of gender-neutral bathrooms, of pronoun ribbons, of communication tags, so we'll get on to that. But Purple Tinker founded BronyCon in New York City. It was a combination of furry cons and Star Trek cons. It made sense because Purple Tinker was also a furry and a Trekkie, so she combined these two elements together. Talking a little bit about how the pony cons kind of took these elements. Think about the Star Trek fandom. The Star Trek fandom basically is a fandom for a franchise. So you have fans of the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, the J.J. Abrams films, all the way to the new Paramount Plus shows. So you have a big, wide selection of fans and guests to pull from. So Star Trek cons could pull guests of honor from any one of these franchises. You have a big pool of guests to pull from. The problem is the My Little Pony fandom is not a fandom for the My Little Pony franchise. It is a fandom for one generation of My Little Pony. Most people come to the cons specifically for Generation 4, especially back in this day. Because if you were a fan of the original generation, you'll be going to My Little Pony Fair. And right now, Generation 5 is still kind of new, so it's still unknown what's happening with right now. But for the longest time, you were going for one generation. The problem is, unlike the Star Trek cons, which started after the original series has ended, the My Little Pony cons are now starting as Season 2 and Season 3 are coming out. So it's a show that's still currently running. So you have basically 6 main characters in the show, voiced by 4 VAs. 4 VAs, 2 of them notoriously hard to get. So now you have, like I said, that map of like 30 conventions, fighting over these 2 VAs basically, and Lauren Faust and a few other IDW artists, and you can see how tricky that becomes. And because of that, I don't need to tell you the story. Something like Unicon happened, and boom, the fandom almost died. The convention scene almost died because My Little Pony cons are in tricky water. At any minute, Hasbro could put down the band hammer, and boom, no more My Little Pony conventions. That's what happened to Harry Potter cons. Because J.K. Rowling and the Turf just said no more Harry Potter stuff, and boom, no more Harry Potter cons can exist. My Little Pony cons, almost the same situation could have happened if the fandom didn't unite together, raise money, and kind of, okay, let's calm down, let's isolate our cons, and let's focus. And this is where we get the Bronies forming a new department, the VIPR department, or the VIP Relations department, also abbreviated as Viper. Some cons will call it Guest Relations, some cons will call it the Grim Room department. But now we have a birth of a new type of department that almost every other convention, because when Unicon happened, think about DashCon. DashCon, a lot of people remember DashCon. Unicon happened before DashCon, and I would say Unicon had an even bigger reverberating effect on the worldwide convention scene. Because not only did the Bronies have an emergency meeting afterwards, the anime cons, the comic cons, the sci-fi cons, the furry cons all knew something similar could happen in their convention scene, so they kind of adapted, and a lot of them eventually adapted the same department that the Bronies had. So let's talk about how most cons traditionally do it. Like I said, most science fiction cons and furry cons will have one guest of honor and maybe one fan guest of honor, and that's it. Anime cons and comic cons have con books that are filled with nothing but lists and lists and lists and lists of their guests of honors. Now, that becomes a little tricky, and a lot of old school convention runners will call these cattle cons because you're basically waiting in line to meet these people, waiting in line to get autographs, waiting in line to get panels, and it's very impersonal. When you go to smaller science fiction cons or brony cons like this, you could kind of just casually go to a bar and mingle with these guests of honors. You really can't do this at this big cons. Not only does it stress out the attendees who want to see these guests, it also stress out the guests themselves. They're pushed from panel to autograph signing, and oftentimes a lot of these guests are like, okay, I quit. I don't want to do these cons anymore. It's like, okay, who cares? We have hundreds of VAs, hundreds of writers, hundreds of other actors we could choose from as a guest. So if you don't want to come to our con anymore, no big deal. Now, that could work for a big anime con or a big comic con, but for a pony con, like I said, basically 4 VAs and a few show staff and IDW artists who are still working on the show. So after your con is over, and if you mistreated them, they'll go to the recording studio the next day and say, hey, yeah, don't go to this pony con, it's giving me a bad experience. You can see why the VIP art department was invented, to kind of make sure that they were well taken care of and not overworked and overstressed. Now, like I said, because bronies have been so heavily influenced by the trans side of the community, it popularized a lot of elements like the communication tags, the gender neutral bathrooms, the pronoun ribbons. Like I said, because big trans influence in the brony community, which makes sense. And because of this started to spread back to the furry communities. So, talking about furries, for instance, like I said, if we consider BronyCon a furry con, it will technically be the first furry con to break 10,000 attendees, which is very impressive. And that would technically mean BronyCon was the largest furry con in the world for 3 years at least, which is kind of interesting. So for example, here is BronyCon compared to Anthrocon and Midwest Fur Fest. So it's kind of impressive that bronies were breaking numbers that an entire fandom like furries were still not yet hitting. So very, very quickly, now BronyCons are kind of branching back to the furry side. You had a group called King Corral that used to make these little felt plushy ponies. They decided they needed to have more cons to sell their plushies at, so they formed corgi events, created Ponyville Ciderfest and this con, Windy City PonyCon. Then they were like, oh, let's make fursuits. So they formed Lemon Brat. Lemon Brat started to sell at a lot of furry cons. They decided to make their own furry cons, like Denver, since they Mercon, painted as a fur con. They even bought an Anime Con in Milwaukee for a period. Large drama, corgi events collapsed. Luckily, Charlie and Michelle were able to save this con and Ciderfest, and now it's under their department, so it's really, really great. So it got spun off from all this crazy drama that was happening. But because of that, through corgi events, a lot of brony elements were brought to the furry fandom. So now furry fandoms are also having gender-neutral bathrooms and pronoun tags, communication tags as well. Most importantly, the bronies brought their AV departments to the furry cons, and now furry cons are making their concerts very similar to how us bronies were doing our brony cons. So in fact, if you go to a concert at almost every single furry con now, it's going to be staffed by an AV team that are all bronies or previously staffed AV at pony conventions. So a lot of bronies in the fandom kind of got big outside the brony fandom as well, so you might recognize a few faces here at this con as well. So yes, bronies also kind of did expand outside the brony fandom, got popular elsewhere, but then you had a period where it was the last BronyCon, and also, the show was ending, so we kind of got the joke that most of the bronies migrated to the furries fandom, so probably bringing the last of the brony style of brony conventions to the furry convention scene. Furries are also taking a lot of our musicians as well, but that's a thing. But then the pandemic happened, so pandemic, big thing. Once again, us bronies step out to the plate because we are kind of the newest of the conventions and kind of the most tech savvy. Bronies have actually been running online cons for a long time. We've made a lot of jokey online cons, so it made sense that during the lockdown, bronies would be the first to kind of make the first pony convention. Specifically, Ponyville Ciderfest spun off of a Discord group that was trying to help artists and was basically the first convention of the pandemic lockdown era. So these online pony cons are starting incorporating a lot of new things that haven't been done before. First, Ponyfest and a lot of other pony cons were partnered with Ponytown. Ponytown, like if you played it, you could create your own little 2D avatar of your character and interact. A lot of these Ponytown online cons will have giant stages where they will screen panels and also screen musical events, and you could interact with your fellow fans online. One online PonyCon in Southeast Asia even recreated like their own little convention center in Minecraft, where you could walk through a virtual dealer's hall and also go to panel rooms that actually stream these panels that were done over Zoom. And of course, the furries couldn't be one up, so the furries decided, hey, we could actually create our own convention centers and VR chat, and it makes sense because if you think about what virtual avatars are, they're basically digital fursuits. So it made sense that after us bronies did it, the furries had to come in and one-up us and create the entire convention centers in VR chat. And in fact, most furries still incorporate the online virtual element with their convention. You go to most furry cons, if you go to the dance, they'll normally have a virtual portal where you can see people in the VR world interacting with people dancing in the real world, which I think is really, really fascinating. And during the pandemic, you had all these different creative stuff, new types of cons kind of being formed, and eventually, of course, cons came back, and here we are. So, over 80 years since the very first Worldcon, and bronies were just a really, really small blip of it, but I would say the bronies left a very, very big impact on the overall convention scene. And while we kind of see these cons as all separate now, they are still part of this giant family tree which have influenced each other. And in fact, a lot of these cons are now just becoming multimedia cons. So a lot of these cons that were once separate are now merging back. And to end this panel, it's about a 5-minute video, but I was at the final BronyCon, and by chance, I recorded the final BronyCon concert, and one of the songs that was being played was Isn't It Great to Be Different, created by a trans brony musician. And I think since it's Pride Month, I want to play this clip And not only is this, I think, a song important to Brony fandom, I think it kind of represents the overall convention scene, all fandoms, anime cons, science fiction cons, furries, everybody. After this video, I'll be taking questions, but I hope you could indulge me for the next 5 minutes listening to this concert. includes 80 years of convention history. Thank you very much for coming to my panel, everybody. And my next panel, if you want to see creating transformative art, starts in 15 minutes. But until then, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to answer them. So yes.
Yeah, well, first, I was in that video you just showed.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, you could only see like me waving my Twilight plushie, but I was there. Not really a question. I just want to thank you for putting on this panel. I had no idea the interconnect between all of these. I thought pretty much all conventions were just kind of like spontaneous collaborations, like people just get together, we should do a convention, and they all come together. I had no idea like this timeline and like how so many just interacted with each other.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Glad you enjoyed it. Then.
Yeah.
Hopefully, if I get the book written, it'll go more in depth.
I'll buy the book.
Any other questions or comments? Or I think we're good. Okay. So I'm gonna get my next.